Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. This is the fifth installment of the Women in STEM speaker series. We started this speaker series after we got feedback from a lot of students saying that they wanted to learn more about the career paths that women who are working in STEM fields have taken. This is sponsored by the Center for Career Education and the Dean of Arts and Sciences. We'd also like to thank College Events for setting this up and running the webinar portion, because we certainly wouldn't have been able to do that on our own. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Catherine Helming Walsh. She is a PC alum who graduated with a degree in biology. She earned her PhD in biological and biomedical sciences from Harvard Medical School, and she currently works as an alliance manager at the Broad Institute of MIT. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Walsh in a minute, but after her presentation, we will invite our Clare Boothe Luce scholars to ask a few questions, and then we'll open the floor up to any of your questions. So at the end of her talk, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A, and I will pose them to Dr. Walsh. So without more further ado, here's Dr. Helming Walsh.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, Maria. And can you see my screen okay? I will.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thanks again for the invitation to speak today. I'm really happy to be here, though it's kind of bittersweet. I wish we were gathered somewhere in that fancy new science building and we could go to McPhail's after and chat. So we'll do our best in this format. But I just wanted to, before I get started, to emphasize, I hope that this can be a conversation more than a lecture. So I'm going to go through my career experience at this point at a pretty high level, and I'll go in chronological order. And then I'd love for it to be more of a conversation around the topics that you all are most interested in. So please ask lots of questions. So just to give a kind of a high level overview of who I am and my background before I dive in a little deeper. I grew up in Hamilton, Massachusetts, which is a small town on the North Shore of Boston. And it was a really excellent biology teacher there that got me excited and invigorated about science and biology in particular, which led me to come to Providence College declared as a biology major in 2005. And I chose Providence because I wanted the balance of strong science, but also the liberal arts aspect of things. So at Providence, I was a bio major and a Spanish minor. I also participated in the liberal arts honors program, and we'll go into more detail on my PC experience in a minute. And then I went to Harvard Medical School for my PhD, as Maria mentioned, in biological and biomedical science, which I will talk much more in detail about in a few slides. And I did my thesis in Dr. Charlie Roberts' lab at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and I'll talk much more about that. And now I work at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. I went there first as a research scientist working on the bench, and now I work as an alliance manager, which is a different kind of position I'm excited to tell you about. So first, I'll dive right into my PC experience. And I have written here that it's, I graduated in 2009, but my ties to Providence run deep and strong, and I'll tell you about that as well. But as I said, I came into PC declared as a bio major, but at the time I thought that all bio majors went to get MDs after, I thought they either became a science teacher or went to get MDs, and I didn't know what I wanted to do at that point. But to highlight some of the important work that I did around science, I did a lot at PC, but I'll focus on the science part. I worked in the lab of Father Nicanor Austriaco, and that was a really important experience for me that helped me understand what it was like to do research and also be a student at the same time. Of course, I took a lot of great courses while I was at PC that were foundational to my background and helped me when I got to graduate school. Some that stick out in my mind. One is histology and cytology with Father Knoll, which was a really great class that I took my sophomore year that really solidified my excitement for being a biology major. I also have very strong and fond memories of my general chemistry class freshman year with Dr. Breen. And that also, when I first came to PC, really solidified my interest in STEM work. And of course, some of the electives like cancer biology and science and religion are things that stand out as well. I participated in several science-related extracurricular activities like AED and Sigma Xi. And I've highlighted here as well a publication that came out of Father Nick's lab a couple years after I graduated, actually, but was something I was really proud of. And just a couple of photos from that time that I had fun digging out of my time in the Austriaco lab. And also when I was a student, I was able to travel to, I think it was in Long Island, to a conference, which was a really important experience as I was thinking about the future of my research career and where I wanted it to go. And I also got to participate in the signing of the charter for Sigma Xi, which was exciting. Another important aspect of my time at PC that actually didn't take place at PC was some really foundational summer research that I did. And so my first summer research experience was the summer going into my junior year. And I did this with Alex Toker, who is a professor at Harvard Medical School and runs a lab at Harvard Medical School and the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And this was the first real lab experience that I had. I had barely used a pipette before I went to this experience, and it was incredibly formative for me in my path toward research. I was working in this lab alongside other, alongside graduate students who were in the Harvard BBS program, actually, which is the program I ended up attending. And I'll also say, which this hits on a theme that I'll get to at the end of this talk, is that I got this position solely through networking and knowing a friend of a friend who connected me to Alex. And without that connection, I think a lot of what I'm going to tell you might not have happened. So that really highlights the importance of networking. And then the following summer, I went to a much more formal summer undergraduate research program at Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York City, where I worked under Jayanta Chowdhury, which was also a really important experience in my decision-making to move to a graduate program following graduation. And so I mentioned that my ties to PC run deep and strong. So this is a personal photo just to show Father Nick drove all the way up to Maine, about 4 or 5 hours from Providence, to perform the wedding ceremony of me and my husband, now husband, who's also a Providence College graduate. So that's just a fun memory there. So from PC, I went to Harvard Medical School to their Biological and Biomedical Sciences PhD program, or as we call it, BBS program. And this was a really appealing program to me because it's known as an umbrella program, meaning that it's a very broad spectrum of labs that students can rotate through in order to choose their thesis work. And so when I came from Providence, I knew that I really wanted to work on some science problem that was related to human disease. And in particular, I had focused in on cancer that I was really interested in and wanted to make an impact in patients' lives, not through treating them as a physician, but through advancing the medical field through research. And so this was a really appealing program because it was affiliated with many hospitals across the Harvard system and also allowed me to rotate through many labs. I also was able to participate in this, what I'd call a sub-program, Leader Human Biology and Translational Medicine program, which was a group of students who were really focused on the translational research, which is the bench to bedside research. And so we were able to participate in some specific curriculum that was focused around disease-based research, and also several extracurricular activities that integrated us with the medical students and allowed us to go to seminars and different extra activities that were really enriching. And then in terms of my thesis research, I worked in the lab of Charlie Roberts, who is based at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. He has since moved actually to St. Jude's Children's Hospital in Tennessee. And Father Nick gave me the advice when I was choosing trying to decide what lab to join. He said that choosing your PhD advisor is almost as important as choosing your spouse. And so I'm happy to talk more about my decision to be in Charlie's lab. I will say I did not regret it for a second, and it was a really important experience. And he remains an important mentor for me to this day. And actually, when I was choosing, I was going through a difficult, I was trying to think about whether I should make this move to my most recent career change, which I'll talk about, which was coming off the bench. And he talked to me for 45 minutes on the phone one night to help me think it through. And so he still is a really important mentor. And so the title of my thesis was Mechanisms and Vulnerabilities of Mutant Switch SNF Complexes in Cancer. So his lab focuses on epigenetics and cancer, specifically around a particularly aggressive pediatric brain tumor. And I'll just give you a very high level overview of my thesis work. Again, I'm always happy to answer questions about the work, so I'd love to talk about it if you'll have questions. But at a high level, the work was utilizing genome scale screens to look for synthetic lethal relationships in cancer cells that could be identified as therapeutic targets. And this was done in collaboration with the Broad Institute's Project Achilles was the name of the project at the time. It's now called the Dependency Map, if you want to Google it. And again, I'll pause and just say that this is another example of the importance of networking, and the job that I got after graduate school ended up coming out of this interaction with the Broad Institute. And so the focus area was around switch-NIF chromatin remodeling complex, which is commonly mutated in many types of cancer. And the concept that was really important for my thesis research is one called synthetic lethality, which is very common in the oncology field and is very important, where at a very high level, the idea is that in your cells, you can have these pairs of genes that basically can compensate for each other. So if you lose one, the other can take over and the cells are fine. Whereas in cancer cells, you have a mutation that renders the cells dependent on this other gene. And so if you are able to knock out the gene or disrupt the gene with a compound or a drug, you could particularly kill the cancer cells, or specifically kill the cancer cells and not affect the normal cells. And so this is the idea behind precision medicine, and is the basis for a lot of research that's ongoing. So since I told you I'm going to tell my story in a chronological order, the next part is I had a brief interruption, I say this tongue in cheek, in my graduate experience, where I was actually diagnosed with leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, when I was in graduate school, going into my second year, or just started my second year of graduate school. And I had to go through some very intensive treatment for over 2 years. And so since this is a career-focused talk, I'm not going to go into the details of this experience. I'm happy to take questions at the end, especially how this relates to the way I think about my career now and the choices that I've made. So the only figure that or image that I'll show is one that I think is very hopeful, and is a picture of me and my husband with members of my Dana-Farber care team, so my oncologist and several others. And I think this is just one, I just want to have this experience in this presentation as a, this is a really, really hard and a really dark cloud, but this was a really important silver lining to be connected to these really wonderful people who are, now a part of our family. So with that interruption, I went back to the lab and went back to the work that I had set out to do. And I'm just going to highlight, this is the paper that came out, which describes the bulk of the work that I did. And I was really proud of this paper, which highlighted the synthetic lethal relationship between these two subunits of the switch-NIF complex. And this work was highlighted in two different research journals, which was also exciting. And I was able to present this at the AACR, which is American Association for Cancer Research, meeting in 2014. So this was kind of how the end of my PhD experience went. And again, out of the spirit of hope and happiness, these are some photos from my graduation from Harvard Medical School in 2015. So now comes the decision of what to do after graduate school. And at this time, I knew that I still really wanted to contribute to science and be involved in cutting edge science. I'd really been bit by the bug at the Broad of the really cool screening and high throughput experiments that they could do there. And but I also knew that I didn't want to lead a lab myself and become a PI. Work-life balance was really important to me, and had always been important, but particularly after my personal experience was extremely important. And I think I also was realizing my strengths, that leading a lab, as Charlie does so well, maybe wasn't my strongest suit. And there were other skills that I could leverage. So since I collaborated with the Broad during my PhD, I did a lot of networking and informational interviewing, which one thing led to another, and a position was opened up that I was able to take. So just to give again, a high level overview of what is the Broad Institute. And this is actually the mission from the website, but I'll just say it's, using the promise of genomics and making tools for biology and medicine, doing work around biology and medicine that can be broadly available to the world. And also the goal is always understanding human disease and helping patients. And so and I should say also, the Broad is a really unique place that has academic labs side by side with more industry-like groups of professional scientists. So I worked actually in quite a hybrid group for about 3 years as a research scientist, which was in an industry-funded project that was embedded in an academic lab. And our project was around the KRAS mutant cancers and looking for new drug targets, and in similar ways that I described for my thesis work. And as a member of this team, I was able to manage several different research associates, so I got some management experience, but also worked with as part of a larger team and communicating with our industry partner. And then I started to think about this and knew that I didn't really see myself working at the bench forever. This was a very bench heavy role, which I liked working at the bench, but I knew I didn't see myself there forever. And again, I'm happy to take questions or talk this through a little bit more. But again, through a series of lots of having coffee with people in the Broad and outside the Broad, one thing led to another, and I was presented with the opportunity to become what's called an alliance manager, which I didn't know what that was before learning about it in this context. And so I'll talk more about what I do in the next slide, but at a very, very high level, I'm responsible for a multi-million-dollar industry collaboration between the Broad and an industry partner focused on oncology drug development. And so what is an alliance manager? At a super high level, it's responsible for making sure that the collaboration is successful in any aspect. So I have to be kind of a jack of all trades. As my supervisor says it, I need to be able to see around corners or put out fires before they start. So being aware of what's happening, both with the scientific teams and with the leadership, both on the Broad side and at the partner. And so the way that we think about it is this pretty simple figure that I have here, where the most important thing always is the science, but there are several other aspects that make this collaboration work strongly. And so one is the alliance itself, so managing the relationship between the Broad and the partner, and also compliance. And my eyes were really opened in this position to all of the support staff and efforts that go to making science happen beyond what happens at the bench in terms of business and legal and finance. And so these are things that I've had to learn along the way in this role, and I'm still learning. And so some of the skills I put on the slide here are skills that you start honing in at PC and a lot of your classes in terms of communication and being organized and thinking strategically and creatively. Also, some other soft skills like emotional intelligence, being able to read a room. And this is all rooted in science, which is the most important aspect to me and was something I was really focused on when I took this job, that I did not lose my identity or my focus as a scientist. And so, again, happy to take questions to this or talk about other types of non-bench careers that I thought about along the way. So a couple of concluding thoughts that I think were themes that emerged for me as I was putting these slides together. One is really the importance of mentorship. So throughout, from high school on, mentors have been really important at all levels around me. So people who are junior to me, people who are at the same level or just one step or many steps ahead of me have been really important in helping me make decisions and just be the best at the job that I'm in at the time. Also, I know it can be painful, especially now, but networking really is essential. And I think for every transition that I've made has been because of a connection, whether it be a formal or a mostly informal connection. And that was, took some work and some conversations. And then lastly, I think it's important to make plans. I'm quite a planner, but my personal and professional experience, I think, has taught me that there also need to be flexible and open-minded. If you had told me when I was in graduate school that I would end up in a role called alliance manager and I'd be meeting with lawyers on an almost daily basis, and I would have told you were crazy. So, but I really love this position, and it's something that I'm really happy to be doing. So I say that, be flexible even with your plans. And then I wanted to also just give you all a little insight into what's going on at the Broad Institute around COVID-19. And I mostly want to tell you this because the Broad is actually processing all the COVID-19 tests for Providence College and over 100 other colleges. And this is something that makes me really proud, both from the PC standpoint and as a Broadie. But the Broad has transformed their what used to be, or is still called, the genomics platform at the Broad into a COVID testing facility. They've basically taken a major platform at the Broad that was processing sequences for researchers and still does, but created this novel automation system. And they've processed, I made these slides a couple days ago, and I know the number is much higher than 3 million, but it's in the millions of tests. And I think this, really highlights the Broad's capacity to quickly implement new technology and their commitment to patients and public health. And so it makes me really proud. And I think I've included a link to be included in the chat with, if you're interested in more information. I am not a COVID expert at all, but there's a lot of great information on the Broad's website. And then my last slide that I want to show you is, again, back to my theme of that my ties to Providence run deep and are still there now. So this is a picture of myself and my husband and our baby Patrick, who was baptized this time last year, actually, by Father Nick at the chapel, the Thomas Aquinas Chapel, Priory Chapel at Providence College. So I put here, class of 2038, the future friar. And so with that, I'd like to thank you. I see it's about 6:30, so we have a lot of time for questions. I put my email here. Please feel free to send me an email. I love to connect with friars, and I've put a couple of questions here as suggested topics that I'm happy to talk more in detail about, but really anything is open to discuss. So thank you again, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
All right, thank you, Catherine. That was very interesting. So I believe we're going to pull in our Clare Boothe Luce Scholars. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Clare Boothe Luce Scholarship is meant to encourage women to enter and stay in STEM fields. So our two scholars this year are Olivia Jo Dickinson, who is an applied physics and math major, and Shannon Rooney, who is a math and studio arts major. And they should be added. They are here. So if Shannon and Olivia want to turn on your mics, and I guess I will randomly choose Olivia to ask the first question.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Walsh. I also want to second that I took general chemistry with Dr. Breen and loved it. And I feel like so many people complain about general chemistry, but because of him, I also have fond experience. So yeah, you touched on a lot of things that are like super important that I've been thinking about: mentorship and networking, especially when thinking about grad school. And you sort of started talking about how important it was to choose a PhD advisor that was going to help you grow academically and also personally. So I just wanted to hear more about that experience for you choosing, as I hopefully next year will be in a doctoral program and looking at labs and how to choose a good PhD advisor.
Great, thanks for that question. I think so in graduate school, you'll have the opportunity to rotate through several labs. And I've said to people before that I think the subject matter is less important than the personality connection that you have with both your PI, the principal investigator, the mentor, and the lab atmosphere itself. And I think also the lab atmosphere that the PI fosters is important to pay attention to. And knowing the type of student that you are. And I knew that I needed a little more help. I wanted a PI who was around. I met with Charlie, at least at the beginning, I think it was once a week. And, he would look at pretty raw data, not super well-formed thoughts. We would, talk about a lot of things as they kind of came off the press. But one of my rotations was with a very, very senior. Charlie was not as senior at the time. He's quite senior right now. So this might be different for a student going to join his lab now. But I rotated through a very senior lab, and, you know, I met with that PI a couple of times, and you had to have like a formal presentation, and, you know, for some people that's great, but for me, I needed a little more handholding, and that was something I wanted. Um, and also I just felt that the atmosphere that he fostered in the lab was important, to the way I wanted to do work and do science. And that was something that could only really be lived to experience. So I would say, you know, again, as I said during my talk, about my alliance management job, if someone had told me when I was at Providence that I would be, you know, in a pretty biochemistry heavy focused lab on epigenetics, I would have been like, yeah, no way. But I really learned to become passionate about it because Charlie was passionate about it, and was teaching me through that material. So hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's definitely helpful to think about, you know, how the development as you as like a scientist may be more important than necessarily the exact research you're doing too.
Mhm.
Sort of like the fundamental like confidence you'll gain through working with a certain person.
Exactly.
I
Olivia,
think, Olivia, you had one more question about related to graduate school. You want to ask that quickly?
Yeah, sure. So I was also wondering, I mean, I'm sure you applied to a bunch of different places and
Mhm.
maybe it was your networking experience and your summer experience at Harvard Medical School that maybe like allowed you to see why you'd want to go there. But what aspects were most important when deciding like which graduate program you wanted to go to?
That's another really important question. Um, so, I mean, at a very basic, very basic level, I also narrowed my choice down to geography, and I wanted to be on the Northeast to be closer to my family. So that narrowed it down for me. But as I mentioned during my talk, the umbrella program nature of BBS, there were a couple other programs, one at MIT that I applied to, and there were a couple in New York City that I applied to. I can't remember at this point, it feels a long time ago, but that I wanted the freedom to be able to rotate, you know, in many different labs. I think it was also important to know that labs were accepting rotation students, and that there was, you know, some places that have a lot of labs, but there aren't a lot of like slots for students. That can be a really frustrating experience. And I also, as I said, I knew that I wanted my graduate school experience to really be around disease-based research. And so for that reason, the program at Harvard, there was a program at MIT, a similar one to the LEADER program that I did. That was also a really important reason why I was particularly excited about this program. So I think those are probably the main reasons, that were the strongest reasons for choosing those programs or that program.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And also, I just liked your point about emotional intelligence and the other soft skills because sometimes as a science major, you don't think about networking or some of the softer skills that coalesce with making you a good scientist, and you might not know what industry you're going to work in. So it's good to keep in mind that those are important to work at too for all of the scientists here listening. So
Absolutely. I mean, whatever career you end up in, whether it's being a PI or a professor or an alliance manager, you have to communicate your work. And so communication and, you know, being able to talk to people about very complicated topics, or being able to reduce the very complicated topics to, you know, being able to talk to someone who's not trained in your field, are very important skills. And those are definitely things that you can be honing when you're in undergrad,
yeah,
especially at a place like PC.
definitely.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. So if Shannon, you want to ask a few questions, and I'll remind everyone else in the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A and we'll ask them after Shannon's.
awesome, thank you. First, I'd like just to say that it's really great to hear from a PC alum, especially in the Boston area. I'm from the area, so super cool to hear about. You mentioned a little bit during your talk about how the Broad Institute has kind of been able to adapt to COVID-19.
Mhm.
I was just curious if your specific position has been impacted in any way by the pandemic, or if it has impacted like your thoughts about the trajectory of your career going forward.
That's a great question. Maybe one I haven't thought enough about. But so at a very basic level, the main change is that this is now my office. I have my Providence diploma right there. That's not a prop. That's always there. So I am working 100% remote. Um, and but what's been really great, the Broad is doing a lot of COVID testing, but the Broad has also ramped up all their lab work. So the lab scientists and chemists that I support are all back in the lab doing their work. So we had a pretty tough time, or as did everyone, in like March, April, May, when everything was shut down. But the Broad quickly was able to get the scientists back in the lab, which was amazing and really helpful. So so the science is actually happening, which is awesome, and I support it from here, which is challenging, but we make it work. And so in terms of the oncology drug development that's going on, we're only, a little bit delayed in our timelines that we had set out for this year, which I'm really proud of our scientists and chemists for that. And in terms of my larger career, that's a really good question. I still remain really passionate about oncology, and COVID hopefully is going to go away with the vaccine, but we don't have a cancer vaccine anytime soon. So that is still very important, and something I'm still very passionate about. So I'm happy to take a step back and let the COVID vaccine go full speed ahead. And then, although we're not really taking a step back necessarily, but, and, I envision that my career in more an administrative type STEM role will probably be more remote than it used to be, but I don't I hope it doesn't change too much. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. Great to hear that your work wasn't too disrupted by the whole pandemic.
Yeah.
And then the other question I had was about your transition from working in a lab to
Mhm.
going into a more administrative role. And how are you able to still be connected to ongoing research? Or like how closely are you able to be in contact with the research that's going on?
That's a great question. And that's something that I try to focus on and pay attention to, because I don't want to move away from that. And it's something that I could easily get lost in the details of what I'm doing in the day in terms of more administrative type things. But what I try to do as much as possible is attend the actual science meetings that are going on between our partner and Broad, so that I'm up to date on the science. Because part of my job too is I'll be in a meeting with leadership from the Broad or our partner, and they'll turn to me and they'll say, well, what's the update on blah blah project? And I'll have to know it. And then they'll say, well, what's your opinion? Do you think this project is going to succeed? Do you think we should, invest blah blah? And I have to have an answer. And that was very nerve-wracking at first, but is pretty empowering as well. So, and it's a good motivator for me to really stay engaged. And also, I've tried to cultivate relationships with the project leaders so that I can go to them and ask them, kind of dumb questions about, like, you showed this graph and I didn't get it, and can you explain it again? Or how did you come to that conclusion? So that if I'm asked about it, I'm able to communicate. And then one thing that I say I'm going to do more, and is something I'm trying to challenge myself to do, is when I'm in these science meetings to ask questions. because it's, especially on Zoom like this, it's really easy to go on mute and turn off my camera and just sit there and listen and not engage. So I try to challenge myself, and this is something I'm saying here, so I'll remember, like, be more accountable to myself, to ask scientific questions in science meetings, which is important. And I think getting to the women in STEM, the women part of this also, and, you know, speaking up in a meeting and, you know, being confident to not, because in my mind, I always hear like, oh, that's a stupid question. They probably mentioned it and you probably didn't hear it. So being comfortable speaking up as well. So I hope that answers that question.
Very great advice. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, so it looks like we have a question from the audience. They want to know, why did you choose to go directly to graduate school? And are there any pros and cons of going right away versus waiting?
That's a really good question. And should I stop sharing my screen at this point so we can
I
see
think
each
you
other?
can.
Okay, that way we
Sure.
can see each other a little better. Yeah, so that's a really good question, and one that I thought about a lot. And for me, I thought that, so I'll say I have several things coming to my mind at once. One perspective on that is I remember talking to one of my mentors, I think it was Alex, at the time, about this. And he had said to me that, you know, a really good reason to not go to graduate school right away is because you want or need more research experience, and you haven't had a lot of experience, so you don't know what kind of research you'd be interested in or what kind of programs you'd be interested in. But he had said, you know, you did research in undergrad, you did 2 summers of research, you know, you've got a lot under your belt at this point. So you've got some really strong connections. You know, he said, I think you're fine to go. I will say that when I, you know, met and interacted with other students in graduate school, those who had taken a year or two to be technicians, for example, in academic labs or in industry labs, had such an amazing depth of knowledge that I, you know, really didn't have. That was amazing to see. And I don't think I would have changed my trajectory, but it's advice that I would give, that if you're at all hesitant, that extra year or two can be extremely valuable. And I can remember being in classes and, you know, the teacher saying, design an experiment. And I would be like, how the heck am I going to design? I don't know what to do. And these people would be like, oh, well, because of my other, you know, the lab I researched in, I know all these different examples of experiments you could do. So I think that was a really important experience for those people. And so there are pros and cons to both. So I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely, thank you. So it looks like we have another one, switching gears a little bit. They ask, did you have any experiences that felt like discrimination as a woman? And if so, how did you handle that?
That's a good question. I guess I'm pleased to say no, I don't feel that way. You know, in preparing for this talk, I thought a lot. I was trying to think a lot about if there were, you know, challenges as being a woman in STEM. And honestly, in my program, and I think this is, so I'll just share observations, not necessarily personal experience, but in my program, which was, you know, like, well, biological and biomedical sciences. So not physics or not like statistics, but in the biology type field, it's actually quite female heavy. And my class was much, I don't remember the numbers, but there were a lot more women than men in my class. But at the professor level, it was much more men. And even now in my role, I was thinking about this, that most, like by far, you know, 75% of the PIs and the leaders at the executive level at the company or at the Broad are men, but all the like alliance managers, administrators are women. So it's just an interesting dynamic, like sitting around the table or sitting around the Zoom. I might be the only woman other than my supervisor, who is also in administration, be the only woman on the call. Um, but so I don't know that I have much great insight to that other than it's an observation. Um, so I don't know that's the best answer.
I think that's a great answer. I think it means we're making progress.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, I don't have a good example of.
Good.
Yeah.
So another question. If there was one thing you wish you had done at PC, what is it?
Oh,
Switching gears again.
that's a good question. Okay, so a nerdy science thing. I wish I had taken genetics with Father Nick. I don't know if Father Nick still teaches genetics, but when I got to, so this is a very personal anecdote. When I got to Harvard, I was not used to struggling in classes. Like I was used to doing really well in high school and in college. And I needed to see a tutor when I was at Harvard, like in genetics in particular, I was struggling. And I remember thinking like, oh, for some reason the class didn't work out in my schedule, and so I couldn't take Father Nick's genetics class, and I was just kicking myself that I hadn't taken it. So that's, I guess, a nerdy example of something I wish I had done. I'm trying to think of a fun example, but it's not coming to me. I loved my time at PC.
Well, it all depends on how you define fun and how you define nerd.
That's
right?
true. That's true. That's very true.
So I don't see any more questions in the chat. I guess I will kind of ask how, since the birth of your son, how have you dealt with kind of adapting to suddenly having that extra responsibility in your life?
Oh, that's a great question. And he's been very well behaved. I haven't heard him.
Excellent.
We have a pretty small apartment, so I'm impressed. We haven't heard him banging on the door. Well, his birth was complicated by COVID as well. So I will say that the Broad Institute has been voted like many years in a row by some, I think Working Mother magazine or something, as one of the like top 100 places to work for working mothers. So maternity leave is long, the benefits are really good, and my supervisor and just the culture is very flexible and understanding, which was awesome. And so of course, like I'm sure all of you have your own challenges at home, you know, with COVID and working from home and schools or daycares closed, like, but we won't touch that because that's just craziness. But I think as I said or at some point during the talk, work-life balance was always something, even in graduate school, before I was sick and then after, that's something that was, really important to me. And so even more so since my son's been born, that, I'll work hard when I'm working. And then when I go home, I don't want to be working. Like, I'm not going to check my email. And I feel like pre-COVID and like lines being blurred and everything, there was quite a good mutual understanding around that, that, if I got an email from like a very high leadership person, I'd look at it, but otherwise, like I really didn't look at my email at night and on the weekends. And that was really something that was important to me. And I think is something that we have to set, like, it's something we have to set for ourselves, because the emails will always come in. And if you respond, then people will respond back, and it's just going to spiral. So I've tried to be as disciplined as possible to not do that. And when I'm with my son, to not be on my phone as much as possible. I mean, with COVID, that becomes a lot harder when everything's blurred. But so I hope that touches on that question, Maria.
Yeah, definitely. So it looks like we do have another question in the chat. Okay, so as women, we often tend to downplay our experiences. Can you talk about how mentors encourage you to pursue the competitive experiences that you pursued?
That's a good question. Yeah, I would say the question kind of answered the question as in itself too, that it's, I think, having the confidence. I mean, I've heard it's said many times that often men will apply to jobs where they don't hit all the requirements on the job description, where women will only apply if they meet all of the requirements on the job description. I think in my experience, having some strong mentors who, and even colleagues who will be cheerleaders for you, to say, like, I would say, like, I don't think I'm ready for this job. Like, it seems like it's too big of a jump. And they're like, you can do it. You've done these kinds of things. You've got the skills. And so, leaning on those people and listening to them, I think, is really important. I would say seeking out mentors as well. I had, of course, like, my supervisor is a great mentor to me, but through the Broad, they actually had a very kind of a formal mentoring program that I signed up for, which paired me with a very senior staff scientist who had been at the Broad for a long time. And we worked together for over a year and then ended up becoming friends, of course, but, kind of coaching me on how to think about the next step of my career. And then, what am I good at? And, like, helping me kind of think through that. So I think this kind of deviated from what the question was asked, but
I think that's okay.
so yeah, I don't know that I have anything else to say about that. But
I guess one last quick question is kind of, how did you ultimately make the decision to switch from the bench job to the more administrative role?
so this mentor that I had, and also colleagues, and challenged me to think about where I wanted to have my impact, and what I was comfortable. So impact, and then also they talked about, like, recognition. And so they said, are you okay? Because this is the position I'm in, is very much like in the background position. So I'm no longer going to go to the conference and stand in front and say, this is my research. I did this with my hands. And are you okay with that? But at the same time, there are about 10 projects in the portfolio that I manage. And we have one is in the clinic, two are, like, heading to the clinic very soon. And so I have my hands in many projects, which is exciting. So it's a different balance. And do I want my impact to be that I was the one who pipetted that gel that, gave us the answer? And maybe yes. Or is my impact that, like, I enabled the scientists to do the work they needed to do, and they weren't distracted by some of the things in the background that I used to find boring as a scientist, I find really interesting now. My impact is letting them, push their work forward, and I can kind of have my hand in many projects, which is interesting and exciting. So that was one way. And then also being able to think in kind of a strategic way, and be able to work with members of leadership, both from the partner and from the Broad, to think strategically about, we have, this 10 project portfolio, and do we want new projects? Do we want to close some existing projects? And thinking at that level was really exciting, and also quite impactful in a different way. So I think those are the main points that I was thinking about.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. So thank you so much for giving the talk. Hopefully sometime soon you can come back and talk in person
I'd love
and
to.
see the beautiful new science building.
I can't wait.
Thank you everyone for attending, and everyone have a very good night.